Hey everybody, welcome back for another vlog post, and today's topic is going to be something I hold dear to my heart. If you're under 30, you're probably not going to know what the heck I'm talking about, but if you're in your late 30s, early 40s, you should have an idea. Atari 2600. Now, of course, this is not an actual joystick, this is a replica joystick. I have something here that is a replica system. It's called the Atari Flashback. They make these every year. You can get them in places like Walmart, Target, whatever, around the holidays and stuff. I still do have my actual Atari 2600. Still works. Went through a hurricane. Actually, still works. Was underwater. And I have the second system, the little Atari Junior. Like I said, as a kid, Atari was my first video game console, kind of where my love for video games came about. And I will be doing a series of videos about video gaming and some of my favorite games of all time, some of my favorite series. So why not start with, to me, the granddaddy of them all? Now, of course, Atari 2600 wasn't the first home video game system. There were some Pong systems. There was something called Odyssey, which I also got maybe 7, 8 years ago. I don't even remember when I got it. No, I take it back. It was longer than that, but it's kind of like one of the early home systems. There was something called Arcadia 2001 that didn't really last long. There was the ColecoVision and the Intellivision, which were kind of direct competition to Atari. They had their own little niche market. They did pretty well for themselves, but Atari 2600 was kind of the king of everything at that time. The home systems really weren't able to replicate the arcade experience yet. They weren't really that technologically advanced, but they had their own, little thing going. In total, I have about 219 Atari cartridges. I know that sounds like a lot, but it's really not compared to all the titles that they actually released, and then titles from other countries and stuff. I don't think there was any type of region lock per se. Meaning, if I had a game from Europe, it would probably work. I'm not sure, of course, but so many positive memories with Atari. Like I said, probably why us, younger kids, you don't know what it is, but like I said, us in our late 30s, or in my case, early mid 40s, we have carpal tunnel probably because of playing Atari. I mean, that just, you're sitting there all day with this joystick going back and forth. It's a mess. So anyway, but I loved it as a kid. My mom and dad got it for me. My dad, he played very little bit. He played like one of the soccer games or something like that. But my mom used to play this game called Mega Mania, which was a very well-known shooter game, like a space kind of shooter. She was really good at it. I really wasn't, but it was definitely one of the games that were really good back on the system. I played a lot of the Atari brand and the Activision brand. Activision is one of the longest running video game publishers. Back then, they were really good. They just put out great games. Now they're kind of money grubbing, and that's a whole other story for another video. But like I said, so many great games back in the day. Just so many memories being in the late 70s, early 80s, childhood, sitting around with your buddies, playing Atari. I can go over some of the more famous games, or at least the ones that I liked. The thing about these systems that's different from video game systems today, it's a very closed ecosystem these days. Back then, literally anybody could make an Atari cartridge and sell it on the system. There really weren't so many restrictions, so there was millions. I take it back. There was tons of different, millions of just an expression, tons of different people that were putting out games. There was Atari brand, there was Activision, like I said, that's when they really kind of came into their own. All these other companies that were releasing games left and right. I mean, very popular back in the day, kind of led to the big video game boom, which unfortunately eventually kind of crashed the video game market before Nintendo came in and I want to say saved it, but kind of did. I will be doing a Nintendo video in the future, but we'll get back to that later. So, some of my favorite games were made by Atari themselves. They had a game called Berserk, where you're just a little kind of soldier in the future in this maze that constantly changes with these robots. You had to shoot your way out. Depending on what room you went into, the robots either really slow, really fast, shoot at you really slow, shoot at you really fast, things like that. So that was a classic game of that time. Combat is one of the games that came with the system. Just basically one little tank or one little biplane, and you're fighting against the other guy. Um, they had an adventure game called Adventure, which was one of the first really popular adventure games. That was really good. They had a series that they started and never finished that was called Sword Quest that included some DC comics. Like they had something to do with it. Um, Going back now, it's very difficult to play because you needed the instruction booklet. See, back then, all the games would come with instruction booklets that were really detailed, would kind of set up the story of the game because, there was like one little dot on the screen. It's not like these super photorealistic games of today. You had to really use your imagination back then. So it's harder to play these Sword Quest games now because it was convoluted and confusing back then. Um, but those were always really fun games. They had paddle controllers also, so not only the joystick, you had these little, paddle controllers. So there was some really cool driving games that utilized that. One of the ones I used to like, I remember, was called like Air Sea Battle. There was another one, Canyon Bomber, where you're just like planes bombing something, or you're like the submarines trying to shoot down the planes, whatever. Missile Command is another one there was a super popular arcade game that did come to the home console, where you're just like five little turrets at the bottom, which is representing your city. You have to defend the incoming nuclear missiles. Of course, in that late '70s, early '80s, we were still at the tail end of like the mentality that we were going to get bombed out of existence. Thank goodness we didn't. um, Moon Patrol is another one I really liked. You're just like a little dune buggy on the moon. You have to hop craters and shoot rocks and shoot down aliens. That was kind of cool. Jungle Hunt was, you're like this little explorer. You got to go rescue your girlfriend that was captured by the natives. You know, uh, Classics like Space Invaders, Asteroids, these like all-time classic video games that were arcade legends that they were able to bring to the home console. I mean, not as good as like the arcade versions, but still really cool. They made like a Superman game, which was the most convoluted, crazy thing, but it was kind of fun. They had one called Yar's Revenge, where you're like a little, lack of better terms, like you're like a little dragonfly fighting this cannon in space thing. Like I said, games back then that were very simple, but they were also really fun and challenging. It wasn't like the games today where there's all this life simulation. It was just like either simple but fun. There was one I used to like, Maze Craze, where you're like a cop and robber running through like a factory, trying to escape. That was kind of neat. There was one called Surround, where if you're familiar with the movie Tron, it's kind of like the scene with the light cycles. Like you just kind of have to box the other person in before you get boxed in. So that was kind of neat. Like I said, there was also the Activision brand games. Like other than the Atari made ones, Activision was probably the most popular of all the other brands that were being made. They had incredible developers at the time coming up with these awesome games. Some of my favorite, Pitfall. Look, everybody pretty much knows Pitfall. Pitfall 2. Those were two awesome classic games. I wasn't ever really that good at Pitfall, but I always liked it back in the day. That was like probably the most popular Activision game. But there was also one called River Raid, where you're like a little jetliner, flying along the river, shooting down enemy planes, fueling up your plane, shooting down enemy ships, things like that. Different kind of games back in the day. What can you say? There was one I really liked, and I want to say it was called Keystone Capers. I can't remember. It had a couple different names depending on whether it was the United States, South America, or Europe. Basically, you're like a cop chasing a robber through this department store, and there's like killer shopping carts coming at you, killer RC planes, beach balls. You go up the elevator, escalator, but you got to basically catch the guy before he reaches the roof, before you run out of time. So that was always fun. Um, I wasn't really crazy about this one particular game, but there was a game called Kaboom where there's a criminal throwing bombs down at you. That was another paddle game. You had to like swing the paddle side to side to catch the bomb so the screen doesn't blow up. I always liked one called Freeway, which was like the Activision kind of rip off of Frogger. If you're familiar with Frogger, it's kind of like that, where you're just trying to get a chicken across the highway. I thought it was kind of funny because like there was one level that was like simulation of the Long Island Expressway where I grew up, which was kind of funny. But you're just two little chickens. It's like a two-player game, or you can play the computer, but you two little chickens trying to cross the highway without getting run over. So that was kind of cool. There was one like a fishing game, fishing derby, that was just simple. You throw your line in, try to get the fish before the shark eats it. That was kind of cool. They had a couple of good sports games. They had an ice hockey game, which was 2-on-2, so it's not super realistic. But for the time, I mean, this is early '80s, whatever. It was the best we were going to get at the time. There was a boxing game where it's just top down. You're just the head and the fist. That was kind of cool. There was one I used to like that was called Oink, where you're like a little piggy, and the big bad wolf is trying to blow his way in your house, and you're dropping bricks down there as he's doing that. That got to be a lot of fun. One I really like called Sea Quest. You're in this little submarine. You have to rescue like divers while like sharks and enemy subs are coming in and all this other stuff. Frostbite was another really cool one. You're like a little Eskimo that has to rebuild your hut before you freeze to death. But you got the polar bears trying to kill you. You got like crabs that are trying to or lobsters, whatever it was. Just silly little stuff like that. Like the games back then were just so imaginative, magic, just so much fun. It was just fun or challenging gameplay. Like they didn't try to be anything super fancy, but for the limitations of the programming they had, like with what they had to work with per se, they were just amazing. I mean, I give those guys so much credit. Those creators are like the granddaddies of the video game industry. Like everything you see today is because of them. But I remember so many hours as a kid. Like I was glued to the Atari. Now mind you, I did go out a lot. I did go out with my cousin a lot. We'd play baseball. We'd ride bikes. We were much more sociable in that era than I feel people are today. But Atari was just a part of the times. Late '70s, early '80s. It was a phenomenon. I mean, it blew up. It was huge everywhere. You had older people were playing it, parents, kids. I mean, it was like video games have kind of morphed these days. I think it's more like a younger generation thing. I mean, yeah, look, I still play a bunch of video games. Okay, I'm going to be 45 in January, but I'm not your average 45-year-old guy. I still think that there are people my age or older that still play them, but it's not quite the way it was before. It's just the genre of the games has changed. The group of people that are playing has changed. Back then video games were kind of in their infancy, so it just, like I said, it just exploded. It was just this phenomenon thing, which was really cool. Some other games I liked. I remember there was one probably sponsored by like the American Dental Association. I don't know. It's called Plaque Attack. You're like a little tube of toothpaste, and you got your teeth, your up and bottom teeth, and here comes like candy canes trying to get them, or like hamburgers or whatever. So you got to like shoot the food with your toothpaste before it eats away your teeth. But the longer you go, the smaller your toothpaste tube gets, so you got to hurry up, and the stuff goes faster. One I really liked was called Laser Blast. You're actually a UFO shooting like Earthlings cannons that are trying to shoot you down. So that was kind of cool. So I know I'm covering a lot of games, not talking so much about the system, but I'm getting to it. But I just kind of wanted to go over some of the more popular games that I liked. I'm trying to keep it brief, so we'll talk about other stuff in the video. But like I said, there were so many other companies besides Atari that made their own, and Activision. Anybody could make a game at that time. Anybody could get it on the system. Believe it or not, there's a lot of X-rated games. I know that sounds crazy to believe, but if you don't believe me, you can Google that, or you can look at YouTube. One of the channels on YouTube, probably the first channel I really fell in love with on YouTube, is called Cinemassacre. It's by this guy James Rolfe, known as the Angry Video Game Nerd, but he covers video games, movies, just a great filmmaker, all kinds of stuff, and he actually has an Atari porn game episode. It's hysterical, but not for everybody. But just you wouldn't expect something like that to exist, but it does. Anyways, let me wrap up about the games real quick, so we can go on to other stuff. Some of the other games I like. There was a Spider-Man game It was hard as hell, but I really liked that. There was a He-Man game that was pretty cool. Um, Atari 2600 was the first time I ever played Donkey Kong, the Nintendo classic. Donkey Kong Jr. The Pac-Man game came out in 1982. Obviously, nowhere near as good as the arcade, but I have fond memories of playing the hell out of Pac-Man as a kid on the Atari 2600. Um, I actually liked that version. I mean, it was nowhere near as good as the arcade, but I thought it was pretty good. Um, there was one. Oh, what was the name of that freaking thing? It was called Zaxxon. It's like an outer space shooter. That Atari, there were tons of these outer space shooters. That was like one of the big genres there. But it was at not isolinear. There's a word I can't think of it where it's at an angle, so it simulates 3D, but you're kind of like flying up, down, left, and right, but on an angle. So like that was kind of cool. There was one called Atlantis that I really liked, where you're literally the city of Atlantis defending. You're shooting up these ships that are trying to bomb you. And there's little parts of the city, so like you have to stop them, and then eventually, once the whole city takes enough damage, you evacuate, you lose the game. There was one that was called Bump and Jump, which was sort of like a racing game, but you're trying to knock people off the road, and you could jump over them, and you would jump over obstacles, you jump over like bridges that were out. That was kind of cool. One two-player game that my cousin and I used to play a lot was called Frogs and Flies. It's silly, like your two little frogs sitting on lily pads, and here comes the little dots that are supposed to be flies, and you got to jump up and eat the fly. And you got, I don't know, minute and 30 seconds. Whoever can eat the most flies in that time. There was one that was like a firefighter game that was kind of cool. You got to pull up the truck, run the ladder all the way up, get your hose up, put the fire out, rescue the people, stuff like that. That was kind of neat. I mean, again, looking at this controller, controllers nowadays, they got bajillion buttons. You got one button on here, and left, right, up, and down. Like you had to improvise. They for the time and for the tools that they had, they really came up with all these great worlds, really imaginative stuff. The music could get a little difficult to listen to, the sound effects, but overall, I mean, just amazing stuff. What are some of the other ones before I wrap it up? There was one called Mountain King, where you're kind of like, sort of like meant to be an explorer, and you fall down in this mine. You got to use your flashlight to get stuff, but you got to watch out for this ginormous spider that'll wrap you up and kill you. There was one called Tutankhamun, where you're exploring like temples in Egypt, and there's snakes and scorpions and all that stuff. There was one similar to the game I was talking about earlier, Kaboom, where the bombs are all dropping, but this one's called Lost Luggage, where like it's an airport and the conveyor thing was throwing luggage everywhere. You got to try to catch that. One of my other favorite games from that era. Again, the Atari 2600 version is nowhere near as good as the arcade, but it was called Time Pilot. I always thought this was like one of the coolest games. You're traveling through time, like you start in like the early 1900s or something, and you're in a little biplane, and you got to shoot down like the World War One planes. Then you go to World War Two, the Vietnam era, the future against UFOs, whatever. That was always really cool. So like I said, just so many positive memories with Atari 2600, and after it kind of died out when it was replaced after that video game boom and crash, you'd go to garage sales. My grandmother and my grandfather would always take me to garage sales as a kid, and you'd get like a box of them for like 25 cents or something. I mean, it was so easy to come across these things. Nowadays, you're talking about only almost 40 years ago, so they're hard to come by now. But back then they were plentiful. Excuse me, they were everywhere. Now Atari, was one of the most well-known and respected names in the video game industry for many years. As they got a little bit up in age, they people changed at the top a lot of directions. Now they're kind of like a shell of their former self. But after the 2600 came out, and that was in 1977. So I mean, I was 2-3 years old. Well, I was 2 years old, basically. That's when I started playing video games. I had some arcade experience, which I'll make another video about that. Um, but you know, that was my thing as a kid. I had comic books, I had GI Joe, Transformers, which was a couple of years later, and Atari, of course. You know, and Star Wars, of course. All stuff I'll do videos about later. After the 2600, you know, was wildly popular. They came out with something called the Atari 5200. And I remember my mom and dad bought it for me for like a Christmas or something. And we had it for like 3 days. We all hated it, so they returned it. Um, it was trying to be an improvement. You know, I see where they were going with it, but it was kind of like a massive failure. The controller was like a piece of crap. I actually bought one many years ago, used with a bunch of games that had been sitting out in somebody's garage. Unfortunately, it didn't work, so I had to go find another system years later after that. But the games still didn't work; they were kind of corroded. But there was one game which I'd love to see kind of remade. It was called the Dreadnought Factor, and you were basically one little ship versus this enormous ship. Think of like Star Wars. You'd be like one little X-wing fighter against one of those giant, enormous star destroyers. So that was kind of cool. That system, like I said, was a failure. There were some great games on there, but it just commercially, it was nowhere near what the 2600 was. You know. Then they came out a couple of years after that, around the time of Nintendo, with the 7800, which was kind of like more streamlined, more like the 2600. Again, good games. With the 5200 couldn't play the 2600 games, but the 7800 could. So it's like you had your new games plus your backwards whatever you owned from the Atari 2600. A lot of great games. I didn't really have it. I bought it used many years later. I never had it. I kind of really didn't even know about it until I did my research years later. There was one game on there I really liked called Karateka, which was like a karate. You have to go rescue your girlfriend kind of game. Made for computer, but made its way on there. And then after that, they had a little handheld system, which was like uber expensive back in the 90s. I never owned that, the Atari Lynx. I had a friend in high school that had it. He had a couple of games on there. I saw it, never really was impressed. Like if I see it at a garage sale or like at a flea market and it's $20, I'll pick it up or something, but I'm not like in any rush. And then, Atari's last system that really they were known for was called the Atari Jaguar, which was supposed to be the first 64-bit system. I'll get into all that later and explain what all that stuff means. Again, a commercial failure. I had it. I got it really cheap on clearance at Toys R Us. Not a very big library, a couple of good games here and there, but they had an awesome Alien versus Predator game. I own that one. That was like one of my favorites. So, okay, so I went a little long in this video about specific games that I like, and really didn't talk about the system and the impact as much as I wanted to. But I see I'm already at 23 minutes. I just kind of wanted to touch base on it. Like when I get to other video game topics, I'll try to narrow it down more to like. More concise. Like this Atari, I just kind of wanted to knock it all out in one video, so that's kind of why I went all over these games. So this might not be the best video I've ever made, but again, this is only like my sixth or seventh video. I lost track now, so I'm still in the learning process, guys. But I do appreciate everybody that sits through them and watches them. If you guys do enjoy them, please subscribe to my channel, hit the like button. That gets more views and gets it out there, and leave me a comment. I always appreciate the feedback because that's how I'm going to learn. That's how I'm going to get better. So if you guys ever have a chance to try an Atari 2600 game, try it. I mean, just to see. If you're a gamer, see something from back in the Stone Age of video games. Most of the new systems nowadays, you can get them on, or some form or another. They've Nintendo Switch is like Nintendo's newest thing. They have an Atari collection that I'd like to pick up if I see it cheap. It's got like 150 games on it or something. This thing that I have here, the imitation thing, has like 100 something built in, but then I'm able to download. Well, you used to be able to download like the free games. So there's like 800 games on top of that downloaded. So I got my Atari fix for years to come. So. Again, I'm sorry, this was probably not my best video, but I just kind of wanted to cover everything that was kind of on my mind. I could sit here and talk about the cultural impact of it, but I don't want to bore guys who aren't really into video games. So anyway, this was the first in the series of videos I'll do about video games. I've got other topics. I'll be covering Nintendo specific games and game franchises that I like. But I appreciate you guys sticking it out, and we will see you in the next video.